It's Morbin time.
Hello everyone! Pineaaronapple here with the first story of a new Big Finish range, Dark Gallifrey, Morbius. Obviously, this set is a story about the Time Lord Morbius, not the vampire, split into 3 parts, one per month, much like the Sontarans vs. Rutan set, which was 4 stories once per month. The next series of Bernie Summerfield audios getting the same treatment. Perhaps Big Finish are attempting some new structure, coming away from constant box sets, and while it will take a while for me to relate well with this new structure, I am pissed every time a box set releases, and Big Finish are too lazy to give each story their own artwork. To use the 8th Doctor as an example, in his box set era Dark Eyes, Doom Coalition, and Ravenous, 4 box sets, 4 stories apiece, all had a piece of artwork per story, while Stranded and stories between What Lies Inside and In the Bleak Midwinter now rely upon fan artists for their individual stories. The Dark Gallifrey line itself consists of 8 3-part stories over the coming years. Currently confirmed the War Master, and of course, Morbius. But looking at the line's trailer, we can expect stories featuring the Nun, Missy, the Eric Roberts Master, Rufus Hound's Monk, leaving 2 entries we know nothing about. But personally, I hope it's not more Masters, unless it's an audio only like Alex McQueen. Perhaps we can get one of the incarnations of the Collective, or as known by TARDIS Wiki, the Multitude. But where that name came from, I have no idea. Maybe the Rani, or perhaps a bigger threat such as Omega or Rassilon. With the speculation of the line out of the way, let's get into the first episode, and since I'm writing these as I listen to them, month by month, I'll review them as separate episodes of one story. First, we'll take a look at the cover of part 1. The editing is nice, although I'm not too fond of the makeup on the Sister of Khan. And the effects to represent the Burning Man and Morbius are interesting too. Now into the story. We are narrated by a character named Narata, played by Janet Henfrey, known for being in both Classic and New Who, in The Curse of Fenric and Mummy on the Orient Express, who gives a pretty good performance for a glorified narrator, really selling the scale and drama of the story as she describes the horror and cruelty, but also the hope that Morbius perpetuated in his time vying for power. In Morbius's final days, as we know from the show, he ended up on Khan, presumed dead, and a piece of him yet to end up given a new body in the vengeance of Morbius. He led a civil war, shredding the vortex with battles, and is eventually defeated, his defeated warriors and cultists being brought back as prisoners to be tried back on the homeworld. After this, we get to hear the series theme, or what I assume is the series theme. Whether it's specifically for Morbius or Dark Gallifrey as a whole is to be seen. But it's a nice piece, haunting screeches, organ-like climbs, and a little electric flavour. Nothing amazing, but different from most themes. More foreboding than triumphant, such as the Doctor Who theme and, say, River Songs or Units. We finally get to meet our main characters, seemingly a group of Gallifreyans who have not been inducted as Time Lords, or what in future Gallifrey will be referred to as Shobogans. Only the captain having ever been given the chance to regenerate in it, leaving them as a different gender and sporadically sane. Being Captain Argento, played by returning Big Finish actor Rachel Atkins. Other notable members of the crew include the ship's second-in-command, the people's person, Mr. Middlewich, played by another long-returning actor, Hewell Morgan, and the put-down-upon, aspiring for a higher position crew member, Rolko, played by returning actor and a fave of mine, Mina Anwar, in probably the only role she's been in that I'm not too fond of. Not because of her acting or anything, but the character's journey was frustratingly clear and predictable. Rolko displays this annoying characterization as a sister of Khan arrives to board the ship, Gilda, played by Lara Lemon. A great name for another returning but more recent Big Finish actor, and Gilda seems to be more of the viewer's main character than the others. Other than being front and centre on the cover, she gets a vast amount of screen time, and her interactions act as our best early way of interacting with the characters before the others get scenes amongst themselves. Gilda is invited into the ship by Middlewitch, accompanying the crew back to Gallifrey for the cargo she holds, while Rolko whines. You have no idea how many takes it took for me to get that 3-word sentence right. Gilda and Middlewitch work off each other well. Well, Middlewitch works off pretty much all the characters well. Gilda is carrying a package for the captain, and I do appreciate the use of naturally unveiling information. There doesn't seem to be a lot out of place exposition-wise. Information such as the captain changing genders or her sickness are conveyed through either natural explanation or clever inference. Middlewitch gets a badass line, and we get a view into the brig where Rolko verbally pisses off the prisoners, using ood as a derogatory term. And we get introduced to Morbius properly through his vessel. They're a race of tentacle Cthulhu-looking people who carry the souls of those that die close to them within them. Although in reality it's probably just their minds trapped in some sort of psychic ability, not the souls. And this one, Veritas, played by Andrew French, harbours Morbius within, who is layered in a lot of sometimes annoying effects, but played by returning Morbius actor Samuel West. Morbius controls his followers strangely, and Gilda is introduced to the newly feminized captain, her purpose being aboard to give the newly regenerated souls some of the Sisterhood's vaunted elixir, to quell the regeneration instability, as experienced by the captain as a sort of cross between a bad hangover and insanity. The higher-ups want to keep this business under wraps, doing well to set up the possibility of a mutiny that brews through the story. And with a mention of Marin from the brain of Morbius, the captain makes it quite clear that no one wants Gilda here before sending her off. The ship sets sail into the vortex, and in a scene with a good dynamic, the captain divulges to Middlewitch that their trip will be longer than they thought, receiving a hypercube from Gallifrey informing them of the damage done to the vortex, meaning they won't arrive anytime soon. Morbius speaks to Veritas and tells an interesting story of his first journey off-planet, and for a scene that shouldn't be very interesting, the performance paired with the ambiance really sells the character.
It looked so small and fragile as we flew away. So I lined up my hand against the viewport, getting the perspective just right. And I pretended I was crushing it.
Gilda is brought from her cabin, surprised that it's been days since they left, time travel having interesting effects on the crew, and she's offered a tour of the ship by Middlewitch. They have some funny misunderstandings regarding the ship, and also being the second time I can recall that Doctor Who felt the need to give mundane birds an origin story. Ravens and Eaters of Light, and now crows, seemingly having been from the vortex before the fighting sent them away to worlds such as Earth. That really didn't need to be here, but I appreciate the slightly ridiculous world building. Middlewitch is given some info by Rolko, their stores having been affected by the movement of a wall, with seemingly no explanation, but also almost tipping off Rolko about the whole long travel time thing, that under order from the captain he is not to divulge. Later at dinner, the captain freaks out about her new body and insults the Sisterhood, salty that the only reason they were on Khan was due to a treaty between them and the Time Lords. It's now that the captain almost divulges the news about the travel time, but there is a commotion outside, an elder officer dying of shock in the crow's nest, and a shimmering man comes through the vortex, a man in pain. I imagine the effect on his skin being like a dormant regeneration, such as when Capaldi playing 12 refused to do so and kept glowing. The man is brought aboard, and the crew really want to throw him back out, but Gilda saves him, as he starts rambling. And while the words are suitably cryptic, while seeming to have meaning, and after writing the reviews of the other two, a fair few amount of the things he says do come back. Rolko is getting salty about this new body business, and having pissed off the captain is thrown in the brig, and the shimmering man is for the time being, until he can be interrogated, relocated to Gilda's quarters. Veritas tells Morbius of the appearance of the shimmering man, his mind at odds with Veritas. They get all culty together and the shimmering man continues to freak out, but mentions the captain by name, making me propose this may be a member of the crew from the future or some such. I was very wrong. The captain and Middlewitch get another decent dialogue scene, but the captain continues to need the elixir. Rolko is talked to by Veritas, who attempts to build a friendship between the two, sowing more discord. But as hinted at before, the walls shift together, making the dimensions of the room smaller than before, as seems to have been happening since the grain incident. Gilda comes to see the captain, wanting to give the Shimmering Man an elixir, but she pretty vocally tells Gilda to fuck off. And the captain gets further on edge with Middlewitch, smashing her mirror in a fit of emotion, still struggling to reconcile with her new body. Rolko is out of the brig and quite bitchy to Gilda, immediately almost pissing off Middlewitch, before informing him of the walls enclosing, the interior dimensions of the ship failing. The captain makes her way to Gilda's room, and in a moment of weakness, wanting to know what the glimmering man is talking about as he seemingly spits out prophecies about grandchildren and islands of death, so she allows the use of one of her elixirs to heal him. Rolko heads back down to talk to Veritas, who explains his abilities with a pretty natural and impressive speech of exposition. And once done, Morbius starts to seemingly manifest and marks Rolko with a tattoo or mark that seems to be some sort of initiation. Not exactly explained, but easily inferred. Hopefully the next parts expand upon this, because I'm not sure I like Morbius becoming a cheap Lord Voldemort with the marks and resurrection, starting as a spectre living in the head of an acolyte. And I really don't want to see a little naked baby Morbius wrapped in a cloak. It's been 8 weeks on the ship now, and the captain finally tells the crew that they have no idea when they'll be getting home. But mid-speech, she's hit with a wave of pain, her condition worsening. They think of sending a message home, and Middlewitch tells her that the crew are getting antsy, but she has a backup plan. The Horn of Rassilon. Supposedly when called, he will come, but Middlewitch doesn't seem to believe her. Making the schism larger, the crew are salty, they haven't been given the Time Lord bonuses like the captain. And Middlewitch storms off ready to chew Gilda out, telling her she never should have given the Shimmering Man the elixir. And if the crew knew he was still there, they might stir into a panic, which does happen, led by Rolko. Gilda able to see the mark on her arm, as Rolko starts to insinuate the man and Gilda are the cause of the dimensional destabilization. And due to this shit, Middlewitch calls Rolko out, barely not shoving her back in the brig. But Rolko tells him that they trust him more than the captain.
Maybe we should get you working in the vents.
I won't cool off in there. That's hellfire work.
If it keeps you out of trouble.
And how long will I be venting for?
Rolko is deeper in the cult and discusses how Middlewitch may join them. Veritas tells her his story, pretty haunting and creative in the writing and performance, even with the Hydrant's voice effects. The captain is spinning even more out of control, stumbling around like a schizophrenic drunkard, as she regrets giving the elixir away, as the Shimmering Man still recovers. And everything goes to shit as Middlewitch tells the crew if something has to be done, he'll do it, most likely alluding to him taking command over the sick woman. And he even lashes out at Gilda for a hot second, but screams start coming from below deck as the crew are being crushed since Rolko tells us they were unfortunately locked in. I wonder how that happened. They spout more witch-fearing stuff as even more crew members have taken the Dark Mark, and the cliff is hung for part 2 as the Shimmering Man's warnings come true when the ship sees an island, everyone bracing for impact just as Middlewitch is about to take command. A pretty good cliffhanger filled with controlled chaos, setting us up well for a part 2. So that was Morbius Part 1, a pretty good setup for the trilogy. The characters were well done, even if not all entertaining. Rolko, for example, being fucking annoying, but by design. And the captain, Middlewitch and Gilda all getting pretty good stuff, and especially Middlewitch being explored and sympathetic. Unfortunately, it fails a little as it's called Morbius, and he is one of the least featured characters. A problem which will become bigger in the next Dark Gallifrey line. But the characterization he is given in those little scenes and the narration at the start are all written well, and the performances from Janet Henfrey and Samuel West do a lot to sell it. And as a part 1, it sets up the next 2 parts well. Something else it gets right is the atmosphere. Sure, it sets up like a Gallifreyan pirate ship, which is quite strange and doesn't feel like it fits anywhere in Gallifreyan lore, but it sticks to that route and does it pretty well. So I'll give part 1 of Morbius, and I really feel like these parts should have subtitles, an 8 out of 10.
It's Morbin time.
So, a month later, and now I can review Morbius Part 2, and boy do we get some good stuff. There are some plot twists that floored me, but we also don't get all the answers, making way for a climactic part 3. But this is from my perspective when the story comes out, so let's get into Morbius Part 2 Electric Boogaloo. We get a nice little recap, good since this is one concurrent story, one part a month, and we pick up where we left off. But not before Narata tells us of a story of how those few who die on Khan are put to rest. A nice little intro, even if it has little bearing on the story, other than fleshing out Gilda and Khan a little. Morbius is still within Veritas and won't let us forget it, as he has designs on a new body and spreading his Voldemort mark like an STD. Middlewitch is confused about the island they seem to have crashed on in the vortex, especially as he seems to get glimpses of movement on the snowy plains. Hymna, surprisingly aware Argento, much better now than we last saw her, takes stock with over a dozen dead, but she calls him out on his mutinous attempts. And much like the dialogue last story, the episode is quite well written, although with faults, once again, by Tim Foley. Middlewitch brings up some real concerns, but decides to use the captain's power, sending Argento out to explore the tundra while he repairs the ship. And for characters that we've basically just met, you really feel their close friendship breaking apart. A real focus in this part of the story. Middlewitch is concerned and Gilda informs him that the Shimmering Man is gone, but he frankly couldn't give a shit. He rallies the people and sets Argento up as incompetent, by making it as if her leaving the ship was her idea. But Gilda manages to convince 3 others to accompany her and Argento. 3 strangely mute, unvoiced, may as well be nameless extras. Argento and Gilda make their way across the tundra, the white hurting her eyes. And these two have a pretty good dynamic, Gilda bringing out the best of Argento without forcing it from her, but also respecting Argento's choices. As they leave, Gilda makes sure the 3 extras haven't taken the dark mark, and instead of actually informing Middlewitch, she is all,
"Beware the dark sign, Mr. Middlewitch. I know not what it is, but I know it is not good."
What? What are you talking about?
We haven't time for this. We're going.
And that shits me a little, but sure, I can believe that that's something she'd say as a member of the Sisterhood of Khan. With their spiritualistic nature. We also get a little more pretty good backstory from Middlewitch, but knowing the Walking Dead effect, that probably means he's on borrowed time, as he also gives Gilda his spyglass. Rolko returns, yay, and convinces Middlewitch to keep the prisoners on deck so they don't get crushed by the dimensions down below. An obvious trap to us, but Middlewitch is actually quite nice about it. Gilda and Argento make camp and are wary of the creatures stalking the ice. But seriously, I found it far too evident these shipmates don't say a word. Sure, they make sounds, a grunt or two, and eating noises later, but at this point they might as well have had Argento and Gilda go on their own, if not to add to the ramping up of the stakes later in the story. Rolko brings Veritas to Middlewitch, and eventually he's convinced to let half the prisoners at a time assist rebuilding the ship, as we see later, quite easily allowing the mark to spread amongst the rest of the crew. Veritas and Middlewitch have some good interactions, and one more good, candid conversation later on. It's quite well performed, but it was clear to me the direction we were going. Argento names the land in the vortex the Isle of the Dead. A pretty cool title, all things considered, and they come across a large, icy temple where the Shimmering Man meets them. Still elusive, but far more put together than before. His lines can be cliché, but he is entertaining, and alludes that the reason he knows Argento is that he saw her here, but we don't get a lot else from him. So we'll have to wait until the next part for more info. Once at the temple's doors, the blizzard suddenly dissipates, and they are met by Morbius. Or, well, a holographic interface of the temple, introducing it as a sanctuary built by the real Morbius. Samuel West does well in making this avatar a character all its own, even if based off Morbius' appearance, the hologram feeling quite lonely and having a mean streak of his own. They enter the temple to find a state of grace, keeping Argento in top health, and a meal fit to feed the whole crew. The 3 voiceless shipmates getting aspects of their personalities listed off by the interface, before they are sidelined into eating machines. While they eat, Gilda and Argento follow the interface deeper into the temple. While back on the ship, Middlewitch speaks with Veritas again, telling him that he may attempt to have them pardoned as defectors due to their help. But the conversation isn't all they hoped, as Veritas compares Middlewitch to Morbius. and they discuss his morals, as while he treated races and his underlings equally, he also believed in equally crushing and genociding races. So, not totally evil, but come on, Morbius is a prick. Veritas jabs at the whole captain first mate drama, trying to work under his skin, but they part ways. The interface shows Gilda and Argento the artwork hung in the temple, depicting his exile from Time Lord society, becoming another talk of opposing morals. As while, yes, Morbius wanted equality amongst his people, he also was a psycho warlord, and on the other side of the conversation, time and time again, Rassilon is proved not to be the saint he is propagated as by Time Lord society. It sparks good conversation, but both sides are clearly just ruled by assholes. The Time Lords under Rassilon being just the little tiniest bit the lesser of two evils, not actively going out there and genociding people, unless you're vampires. The interface mentions some strange events, ending on the death of Morbius on Kharn, a fixed point, and the interface reveals this temple is many years ahead of the war, him being left here for a long while. They enter a hall of mirrors, and while Argento is originally unable to look at herself, she follows the interface deeper, finally coming face to face with her fears. First herself, and then a gobsmacking reveal as we see her descendant, the Collective, better known as the 11, played here by Mark Bonnar, in spectacular fashion, speaking to her through the mirror. The story doesn't waste this twist either, as it's explained Argento's aversion to regeneration continued down the family line into the Collective, manifesting in them as their regenerative dissonance. A reveal that came totally out of left field, but carefully thought about, not just thrown in as a cameo. And the interface really rubs the cruelty in. He pokes at her, alluding to Middlewitch's upcoming demise, and Gilda finds herself attempting to rescue someone from inside the mirrors, seeming to live inside the vortex. The being also laughs at her, but I can't tell who's laughing, so it could be an allusion to another aspect of the story, but I assume it'll come into light in the next part. We come back to the dining hall to see the Shimmering Man speak to the interface, and while interesting, it doesn't give us much other than confirmation Morbius is returning, and that the Voiceless Three are doomed, as they choke on the food and the dining hall literally dines on them. The ice of the temple, and even the island later, seeming to have some form of sentience. Argento isn't too happy about this, her and Gilda running, managing to make it out of the living building as the interface menaces at them from afar. Back on the ship, Rolko takes Middlewitch by surprise, tying him up and keeping him unconscious as the whole crew has seemingly been taken over, Middlewitch seemingly fit to sacrifice to resurrect Morbius. Narata gives us some nice viewing into Middlewitch's psyche. Once again, the Walking Dead effect, but the stuff she gives us is pretty good, and he wakes to find himself on the tundra, being taken towards the temple. Gilda and Argento mourn the lost men, and with Argento now feeling wounded again and compromised by seeing her friends deconstructed in front of her, their terror reminding her of Middlewitch's face as he watched her die. Veritas goes the poetic way of informing Middlewitch of his upcoming death, and has the crew dig by hand a hole to toss the sacrifice in. Middlewitch having a good moment, as he at least wants his mutinous crew to be given gear to dig. Gilda and Argento wonder where the Shimmering Man is, and they regroup at their camp, once again having a good philosophical talk.
After all this fighting, I thought I was numb to defeat, to death. But this body doesn't feel as tough.
It's tough, all right. For it has Captain Argento at its helm.
And Argento tells Gilda she feels that her crew is out on the ice with them. So Gilda scouts for them with the spyglass, but the creatures are nearby, getting the two running away. Middlewitch spots the mark of Morbius and fails to talk Rolko out of sacrificing him as they toss him into the hole and start filling it. In a nice payoff to part 1, Argento and Gilda spy what the supposed creature is, turning out to be a mass of crows. As we were told in part 1, they used to fly in the vortex, but we don't learn much more than that, as I don't think they appear in part 3 at all. Veritas and the followers let their marks slither into the ice, turning it black and pulling a goblet of fire. You know, marks of the servant, willingly sacrificed. Bones of the Middlewitch, unknowingly given. I think that was my best joke of this whole Morbius Voldemort thing. Within the ice, Middlewitch is pretty gruesomely possessed and transformed into Morbius, as the crows turn overhead, and Gilda and Argento seemingly make it to the ship. Using the spyglass to see the crew, praying as Morbius quite grandiosely rises. So in desperation and fear, Argento, referencing the first part again, as she uses Rassilon's trinket to call him to save them. The story ending as she does so, and someone appears, but I'm guessing it's probably not going to be Rassilon. Personally, considering the Doctor's appearance next part, Tom Baker will probably show up and go, "Hello everyone!" So that was part 2 of Morbius, and much like the first part, it was great. In fact, I think I enjoyed this a little more than the last. This slid in well after part 1, continuing the characters well, me liking them a little better when put into the more action-focused second part, while the first mostly focused on being explanatory, exploratory, and atmospheric. But here the story kicks up and integrates well, using the call of Rassilon, the crows showing up, in clever ways showing that this 3-part structure isn't an afterthought. Morbius does more than sit in Veritas, but Samuel's performance was much better as the interface, having a kind face but his cruel and passive-aggressive tendencies coming along naturally. And while the Glimmering Man was better here, he was still just a mystery for the final part. The inclusion of the 11 and giving a consistent and clever explanation to his regenerative dissonance with seemingly no forewarning was fantastic, especially since it could have just come off as fan wank, but it's natural to the story and is a pretty cool addition to Argento's character. The stuff with the crew and Middle Witch was a little underwhelming. I was far more interested in Gilda and the captain, so every time we went back to the ship I was thinking, alright, are they going to go evil yet? But it was still well done, not lazy or bad in any way. The ending for the part was a nice setup for the final part, both with the call of Rassilon and the resurrection of Morbius, really sucking you up for it, even if it's a bit away. But I seriously can't get over how in this story, these elements of Morbius I don't remember being from any existing Doctor Who media really make him feel like Space Voldemort. And that just can't be a good thing, because every time I find a connection I just start laughing to myself. And that's doing the character a disservice. At least that's what I think. But otherwise, again, he was used better than in the last part. So overall, with all this together, I'll put part 2 just above part 1 at an 8.5 out of 10. I'm seriously enjoying this on a story, character, and atmospheric creative level. I just hope that part 3 will live up to this setup.
It's Morbin time.
Finally, we have the last part of Dark Gallifrey Morbius. One that ends the story well with some interesting concepts, but somehow I don't think it measures up to the last part, but that doesn't mean it's bad. But with so much intrigue and clever twists last episode, this one feels a little lesser as it wraps up the story and making 1 or 2 missteps. We get a pretty good recap of the last 2 parts, even if it does take like 2.5 minutes, and then the credits to get to the story. As I predicted, the call to Rassilon calls the 4th Doctor, or at least an aspect of him. And Tom Baker does a very good job here, not only in being the 4th Doctor, but this 4th Doctor is a Matrix aspect, a recreation that only has a limited time to assist. And although the difference is slight, he comes across as an emulation of 4, without compromising the character. He also gets some very good interactions with Argento and Gilda, which are sufficiently funny, but also serious, like having to tell them that he isn't in fact Rassilon like they hoped. We also get the reveal that he is who Gilda saw in the Hall of Mirrors, so there's one question answered. 4 spent some time getting his bearings, coming to grips with the fact he doesn't have his scarf, and he learns exactly who he's in the presence of as Argento gets worse and passes out. On the ice, Morbius in physical form, a pretty good performance from Samuel West, immediately starts spouting glorious nonsense. Unlike Voldemort, actually having his nose after resurrection, and he senses 4's arrival, but decides the Doctor isn't too much of a threat, so he goes with his minions back to his temple of carnivorous ice. Argento wakes up and comes to terms with the situation, unamused when 4 is ecstatic at learning he's on the Proteus. On Morbius' island, finally getting him to focus, learning of the danger. Coming up to the temple, the Shimmering Man comes across Morbius, and after some more confusing riddles, Morbius just up and kills him. Well, that was one plot point we don't get an answer to, which, sure, it gives Morbius a good scene to demonstrate his power and anger, but it's wholly unsatisfying when the Shimmering Man has been such a focus of the past 2 episodes. The only thing I remember coming about from his comments being that, according to the TARDIS wiki, he mentioned Argento would meet the son of her son, which did happen with the Multitude/Collective, or whatever you want to call them. Pretty disappointing in retrospect. 4 reminisces about the brain of Morbius, finally getting the full rundown of the situation, with Gilda keeping watch. And we get some nice little bits from Argento, like her regretting the way she's treated Gilda, and giving us a better look at her regenerative issues. The performance really showing her desperation, and the Doctor unable to cure her, so Argento resigns herself to power through her issues. I like that they're giving her a lot of agency in her right mind. Now that we've seen her at her worst, having her properly cognizant can make her feats feel greater, but also explore how she feels about her condition through her bipolar thoughts. Back with He Who Must Not Be Named, Samuel West gets to play against himself with some humour thanks to the hologram, but the hologram is killed just as Morbius decides to use the Dark Mark to command his Death Eaters to unknowingly sacrifice themselves. All but Veritas having their energy pulled into a part of the temple. A nice way to show how unhinged and evil he is. But also feels like a little bit of a waste when it comes to characters like Rulko. Morbius's temple is gaining in power, clear from the Proteus, seen with some nice dialogue between 4 and Gilda. 4 exploring what it's like to see his own history. In a very interesting twist, the temple is actually a time rotor. You know, the thing that sits in the centre of the TARDIS, which gives 4 some real, oh fuck type feelings. But here is where we get the explicit confirmation that he's the figure Gilda saw in part 2, which honestly feels pretty unnecessary. Much like the Shimmering Man, just feeling as if it goes nowhere. The energy from the temple uncovers a memory of 4's from the Matrix, Dark Gallifrey. And yes, this is pretty much all the information about Dark Gallifrey we get from the story. They just say it a bunch of times and hope that you're content. Now, having heard part 1 of the War Master set, I do know that it will be explored later on, but it feels like the only reason they bring it up here is so that you know Dark Gallifrey is not just the title of a theme, but a concept in universe, so it doesn't come out of the blue in later sets. But let's be real, I think, at least so far, Dark Gallifrey would have worked if it were just a theme. These being stories about the not-so-good Time Lords. 4 gets an idea inspired by Gilda using the remains of the shattered mirror from part 1 of the ship, interrupting the deaths of Morbius' followers, allowing 4 and Morbius to communicate across the distance. Leaving Veritas alone to huff some real copium in regards to the deaths being justified. The dialogue is one of the best parts of the episode, the performances working together quite well, and the interactions also being written very well, with a lot of misunderstanding and wordplay, as 4 continues to disrupt his energy, angering Morbius so much he decides to come to the Proteus himself to stop his gateway from closing.
Nonsense, Morbius. You'll be a wonderful stooge.
You've made the foolish mistake of telling me where you are.
Did I? I could be anywhere on this island.
You are on the Proteus.
Well, luckily for me, you're rather far away, and it won't take long for this ship to close your gateway entirely, Morbius. So say goodbye to Dark Gallifrey. Whatever it is, wherever it is, it's safe to say you will not be heading there today.
4 asks about Dark Gallifrey, Morbius basically saying, if you know what Dark Gallifrey is, then I don't have to tell you about it, ha 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 ha, but also describing some sort of army there. Morbius tells Veritas to stay, who only now questions his actions, mourning the dead, as Argento is a little bit angry at the Doctor's plans, or lack thereof, and the Doctor thinks the 3 of them can take Morbius on. But he eventually figures a plan out once learning about the ship's shifting dimensions. Morbius arrives at the ship, Gilda confronting him about Middlewitch's death, a nice confrontation from the meek character. 4 and Morbius finally meet, having his retinue come aboard and stand guard. 4 and Morbius get some more nice verbal sparring, not as good as before, but still good. Morbius wants to destroy the ship, as it interferes with his plans. His only option to have the Doctor switch off his disruptor himself.
You could shut down the scatter mass safely with a flick of the switch. But I'm afraid I have to do the flicking. Biometrically locked, do you see?
You seek to bargain with me.
Well, I have a pretty good hand. This one, hello, old hand.
But I can tear that hand from you. And to operate this switch, I would wear it like a glove.
The Doctor quite eloquently calls this version of Morbius the mind of Morbius, and continues to poke Morbius into being foolhardy, going into the lower decks with the Doctor alone. Gilda and Argento are hiding in the secondary control room, planning to take off into the vortex to die, Morbius along with them. This Morbius gives us some exposition, having gotten the Time Rotor Temple, its workings and the way to gain an army from a future self. A nice detail. But this is when the trap is sprung in a fantastic idea and execution. As in a rematch of their combat from the brain of Morbius, the Doctor makes the game a little different this time, confronting Morbius as he hides and faints away from Morbius in the switching and swapping walls. Samuel West's desperate and furious performance, once again working well off the jovial Doctor. Gilda and Argento get a good scene as Gilda starts to panic, but Argento is resolute that they should sacrifice themselves to save the universe, taking off into the vortex as Morbius badassly starts breaking down the walls by fist. And only now realizing 4 is a projection from the Matrix, fighting him mentally with another well-written battle of morals, but also a physical spar to the death. We get a nice little scene in the middle of the action as Veritas says goodbye to a wasting away Ralco, still enthralled even as she dies. Veritas gets a communication from Argento, so he has to give her the bad news. And after a nice little character detail, he lowers the force fields so that the ship will collide with Morbius's gateway to his promised land. Ralco is still insistent that he stops interfering, but he continues to help and decides to carry her with him much like Morbius earlier. In a pretty cool and clever move, in the Mindscape, 4 summons the hodgepodge Morbius from his original story to fight Morbius for him. What a kick in the vanity that must be. Although it doesn't last long. Argento, and to a lesser degree Gilda, cheer as they fly into oblivion, knowing Morbius will go down with them, as 4 is recalled to the Matrix, only humiliating Morbius more. With Morbius dealt with, the other passengers open up a door to the vortex, and hoping the young woman will survive, Argento gets a fantastic last moment, throwing Gilda overboard and sailing into true oblivion. Veritas appears again, happy Morbius is gone, and that he gets to die along with all his soul buddies. Gilda falls through the vortex, 4 attempting to reach her, and reassuring Gilda that in the end it was all worth it. The Proteus becoming a ghost ship inside the vortex, popping in every now and again, becoming legend, making Argento a household name thanks to her actions. And he asks her that should she survive, she should warn others of Dark Gallifrey, which ends up feeling a little cheap, but I do admit ties in well as we learn, once landing in the past of Khan, she becomes Narata, the older woman who's been narrating this whole story, coming full circle in a both happy and slightly melancholy end, as she is accepted by the Khan of that time. So she started writing, changing her name, and eventually she meets a young Gilda, who we get to see saying goodbye before voyaging aboard the Proteus. A very clever way to take the story full circle, and written and mixed pretty well. So that was part 3 of Morbius. Now while I think episode 2 is my favourite, this is a pretty good conclusion to the story, even if it kind of unceremoniously drops points from the past 2 episodes. We get great set pieces like the fight under the ship and in the mind, and excellent acting between Argento, Morbius and 4. But let's be honest, you almost can't go wrong with 4. The way the story comes rounding Gilda being Narata is probably the best way they can play it. Otherwise, having the narrator would have felt pretty unnecessary, along with the chapter segregations. Chapters that split each episode into parts, but not the parts on the track list, oddly enough. For what is supposed to be the big finale, the writing and dialogue is great, but there is a little bit of middling around. Or should I say, middle-witching around. Haha! You can comment about how bad that joke was if you want. But that feeling comes about as they go in circles a little bit. Argento and Gilda, then 4 and Morbius, the 2 pairings getting most of the scenes, and the little variations we get are mostly only short in length. Just a little more variety in character interactions, or at least the pattern of them would have been nice. There were a couple of unnecessary details, like 4 being the figure seen in part 2, which doesn't really matter. The Shimmering Man added almost nothing, and the inclusion of Dark Gallifrey as a concept feels overused, as they keep mentioning it repeatedly with no actual information, not telegraphing the stakes sufficiently. So that Morbius opening the gateway and getting his army of who knows what is almost inconsequential, and we only know how bad that is because we're told. Or at least that's how it felt. With just a little retooling, it would have worked much better. Like how 4 using Morbius' anger against him is clever, but with how quick it happens, it makes Morbius, this mythical figure, supposedly back to his full power, look like a little bit of a chump. Even with those little upsets, it was a solid finale, It just wasn't my favourite of the three, so I'll slide it just under part 1 as a 7.5. Quite good, but I found myself liking part 2's intrigue and creativity, and part 1's bottle, almost shining like isolation and cabin fever themes more. Thank you everybody for watching my review of Morbius Part 3. Originally this was just going to be one long video, but I ended up recording for about an hour, so I decided to split them up and release them across the week. Please like the video if you liked it, comment down below if you wish, and consider subscribing to the channel, and if you do, ring that notification bell so that you're told every single time that I make an upload. Once again, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next review. Bye!
Toast. A little piece of toast. Because there's so much to choose from. There's brown bread, white bread, all sorts of wholemeal bread. It comes in funny packages with writing on the side.